everybody, welcome. I'm Kyle Decoyan. I'm the Executive Director of the Poetry Project at St. Mark's. I'm so excited for tonight's event and just so grateful to Jill Magi, who's joining us right now from Abu Dhabi, and to Ammiel Alcalay, who's with us through a snowstorm in New Hampshire. And I'm grateful to all of you too, who I know are joining from so many different places. Before we get into tonight's reading, I do want to attend to some general structure. I also would like to thank everyone at the Poetry Project who is making sure that this event runs as smoothly and thoughtfully as possible, and hopefully without any malicious intrusion. So thank you to Matt D'Angelo, Anna Kreinberg, and Roberto Montes. Anna is going to drop into the chat a link for Zoom FAQs. We're going to keep this public chat open in case anyone wants to express accolades or admiration or just say hello. Your microphones are switched off for the time being, and you're welcome to keep your video camera either on or off. Please just note that this event is being recorded. So if your camera is on, your face may be visible at some point in the archived video of this event. In the upper left corner of the Zoom screen, I also want to note that there's a link for a live transcription through Otter AI, in case anyone may appreciate having access to that feature. We're doing our best to maintain safer space within this digital gathering. And I'll ask Anna now to also share with everyone our statement of safer space. If you do receive any unwanted private communications in the course of the event, please just chat any of the Poetry Project staff and we'll get it taken care of right away. If we were gathering tonight, as we have for 55 years in shared place as well as time, we would be in the parish hall of St. Mark's Church. We are committed to continuously and critically engaging the history and future of our presence in this particular space. And as part of that, I would like to acknowledge that our venue, as well as the place I'm speaking from tonight, is built upon unceded Indigenous lands, specifically the territory of the Lenape people. We recognize the continual displacement and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people and people of color by the US, and are aware that these kinds of acknowledgements can be misused as stand-ins for actual decolonization work, which is something for us to bear in mind as we go forward in our ongoing commitment to accountability, reparation, and equity. We invite you to join us in this work from all the different places where you are, and are sharing another resource in the chat, a map through nativeland.ca, not as an endorsement of this resource's completeness, but as a starting place for those who we hope might feel encouraged to consider in new ways the histories of the places where we are. We usually set up the chairs together and put them away together in the parish hall at St. Mark's, and I find that even as we gather in these more remote grids, our community is still finding ways to make and hold special listening space together. So thank you for being with us and for figuring it out with us. We've made all of these online programs free, and we've also continued to pay poets and artists for their readings, performances, teaching, and writing. So if you feel moved to offer your support for this work, Anna is also going to place a link to donate in the chat. And now I'm going to turn to introducing our readings for tonight. And Jill Magi will be reading first, and then following Jill, Ammiel Alcalay will read. In many ways, I think of Jill Magi's work, her most recently published book, Speech, as a work of doublings, couplets and repetitions, things inside of things or modulated, metonymous for one another, pairs which might be allies, antagonists, beloveds, strangers. This is a work where the global and the individual, the civic and the subject, systems and their constitutive elements are conspiring, extrapolating, simultaneous, continuous. The speaker of speech is very much a reader, Also a listener, a documentarian and collagist, conscious of the many material aftermaths that reverberate from perlocution here where we are, crossing the street, at the market, making our daily motions through care and the quotidian. Throughout this work and beyond it, I also think of Jill Magi's work with textile, a nearly adjectival word. I think of the text of fabric, the fabric of text, and how language is literally, representationally, and also immaterially a thread or force of the social. What is imperceptible and also inextricable? What are the responsibilities and failures of speech to name, address, counter these bindings? Jill Magi splits her time between the United Arab Emirates and Vermont. She works in text, image, and textile, and her recent learning focus is in textility, how its disposition upsets all kinds of binaries. She has had exhibitions at Grey Noise, Tashkil, NYUAD Project Space, and the Brooklyn Textile Arts Center. Her books include Threads from Future Poem, Slot from Ugly Duckling Press, Labor from Nightboat, and Speech, also from Nightboat. And her handmade books are collected by the University at Buffalo Poetry Collection. She's taught at CUNY, Eugene Lang College, Goddard College, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Columbia College, and now at NYU in Abu Dhabi. With Sara Al-Mahari and Shama Al-Bastaki, she is co-founder of the UAE-based chapbook publishing initiative JARA Collective. Please welcome Jill Magi to the Poetry Project.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for that introduction and also for inviting me. And what can I say? Thank you to everybody at the Poetry Project for making this happen, and everybody who has worked at the Poetry Project. What a huge place for me. And when I was trying to figure out how to be a writer and poet, I went every Wednesday, every Monday, to learn. So it's really a learning space for me, and quite a community space. I'm really honored to read with Ammiel this evening. I think I can say that Ammiel was part of the editorial group that selected Threads, my first book, for publication. And I respect and honor his work so much. And so it's very exciting. And thank you all for being here, whatever here is these days, right? So again, many, many thanks. So I'll be reading this evening, my morning, from Speech, which is my latest book. And I think Kyle set it up very well. So I'll just say maybe a little bit is that Speech features a person who is walking through a city that is somewhat like Abu Dhabi and somewhat like Chicago. And I wrote this book while I was learning to weave. So that seems pretty important to say. And I think the other things will sort of show themselves. This is a very citational work, so you might hear echoes of poets that you know, perhaps. And then there are also some epigraphs that start each section, and I'll read some of them, but maybe not all of them. So this is from Speech. Some various West. So this is an epigraph from Faisal Devji's book, The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence. If Gandhi's vision of nonviolence is to be taken at all seriously today, we ought to acknowledge that one of the great challenges facing its proponents is to think about what a citizenship of the world might look like that does not invoke the rights of man as its justification. For unlike rights, which can only be guaranteed by states and are thus never truly in the possession of those who bear them, duties belong to individuals and cannot be stripped from them. Risk writing into the problem. Twice she did, twice the verve of youth writes a letter to the editor, so sure of rights where speaking ricochets off rib and femur, then sinks in its ink. Therefore, if the newspaper says so many infractions were labor, then whose pay? Whose protest sails in from elsewhere, eager for this news? For the region receives the overblown secular, measured out in doses of official speech. News as other, scratch on it. So implicated in a cleaner art, she thinks of the men who all press send, who cares to read the waterproof banner, who says art, who dips down into the city of always plunder or savior, which? How to plunder here and there. Do you see her not speaking in your own city? Woman declaring climacteric, pinpoints your geography never as only your own. As she mirrors them, they sail in with strong arms, sleeved in simple ideas, sweeping diasporas up, rowing across World Bank impact, with the force of enlightening a better day, always someone else to pay. As her electric silence asks, what are you doing here? Answers, rowing enlightenment against brown people in a regular meter, in a tradition against, a veil, a stripped progress imprint, returns the news of betterment. This book, its fissure, its freedom, presses release on the simple button. As water works its way down into the other city, where they puzzled over her arrival, a stranger of white, walking in on territory guidelines where private police badges nod her through to an enclave is a university, declaring its right to know. Who walks into the hills where revolutionaries occupy? Who is deported or shot for roads, for mining, as inroads come, hailed as progress, for hauling off the wealth, as a presidential visit in whose skin has the developing world arrived? Which you? Under the forest is a forest. Under your electronic progress statement, under your elected protection statement, until crone, until your knowledge of this never leaves, knowing corporations are not abstractions, and an island for high culture underdevelopment crosses out rights until the Rights Commission returns, tossing skulls over walls, tossing burial ground pamphlets into the gap between the federal building foundation and sand. Emptied and full of bones was another city. Which island? Which grid? More than saving, more than winning the debate, more than investing in the hills where mists cover the truth of what is mined, a tree saves itself easily. While knowing this says, I walk to devolve thick freedom. Meanwhile, at the institution everywhere, inside the room of miniature thrones, everyone takes a seat to put in their pocket. She patterns who will not read her, but that is already written, so start over. Meanwhile, at the institution everywhere, men write the labor problem on which they lecture as new experts in the common area tonight, in the form of one microphone, as rows of chairs focus us on not speaking, as everyone signed in on clipboards, signed up for the paycheck, down in the common room, and on the way to the upper floors later saying, that was fun, is an economy of too many arms, snatching up another study. Their purses of discomfort make work to clean the others. Their purses of study open up hungry as I don't know you comes crashing into a dream of what is mine. And as Dr. King began his speech at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, she tied her sneakers. As he criticized class systems that segmented America, she put a small towel in her bag. As he incorporated women's welfare rights into his 1968 agenda, she opened her front door and locked the two locks behind her. As an anti-communist fanatic stabbed Dr. King in Harlem in October 1958, nearly killing him, she pushed the elevator button and stepped inside. As Kennedy delayed fulfilling his campaign promise to equalize federally assisted housing, and the SCLC inaugurated Operation Breadbasket to address the crisis of joblessness, she got off the elevator and opened the glass door of the gym. And as King's visit to India solidified his anger at poverty and imperialism, she pushed the button to start the treadmill. This steep repeat. To pack and go quickly while others ship boxes for the next generation's object relief. For stability constructed from cheap iron bookends, one still life unframed, one family Bible, a worthless vase, and speech as marble pillars elsewhere, this steep repeat. Don't point your finger at me, said at the border as it spits up this sharp mother, this impossible mother speech, while he thinks through rights where always peaceful is a polite choice. Political and stamped, she listens, thinks, if you had 1 hour, you would go to the bank to close an account, to withdraw all, and who does not? Or who plans? Who has? While an impossible citizen thinks that others also felt pain yesterday over her shoulder, this book follows her with no speech as she walks. She thinks that others grieve, also a fence, a diagnosis, a sudden phone call, or slowly the news presses into the nation underneath the nation. The war under the war presses against the door behind the door into the person who is two maps at once. At the base of society, she finds the base of her skull. Her superstructure waits for shifty instrument feedback until a father went refugee status for her to say, there, I can say anything I want. This has weight, was home. His slouching historical back, his bones as feathers, their secret fissures ask, did you know there is an organization determining how free is your country? Check your rating, fluxing. Whose country? Which you? Whose heat? Not the refugee with his pants unzipped, his pants short. Messy tourist go loud and others stealth. Messy citizen goes loud, or who makes themselves small in public space or wanders freely looking up. Say hello to the gap in her dictionary, a gap in her blouse. To cover this up and stop speaking in such an accent she never learned his tongue. To cover this up, his too many arms, all the hands to cover up his gaping accent. What is the code for a small family on a street hovering over a baby without food over the baby's last bottle? Who is programmed to want to see and to see? She stays with the baby while he goes to find food. Their backpacks snag the screen of pity, snag donations that delete barbed wire, delete bodies in line. Who is not pictured, who is left behind, where the siege follows the edges of buildings. Not running in vectors, not the drama of open air choice. This image of a single file, her child following closely behind. Who guides them through waiting at the intersection is a body bent. What if refugee? Can you curl into smaller? Strategy of many necessary for empathy to quickly release and flee when later comes grief, when the heat of the quick melts into the long silk of loss. Will you thrive, wanderer? What your speech will be? Later or now is literature. Please package our theory, not too wet, please. Our tissues have not caught up with your refugee, we agree theatrically. The mother pulled the box of important papers out of the refrigerator. A prisoner mother is not impossible. Late afternoon, the door behind the door knocks, nearly kills. This repeats. While with disposable income, I spot a refugee at Europe's freedom and borders, eating and eating. She was my father as time slips from my new nomad satchel, as time laughs at his short pants, at this wet book. The book, always she, always wrapped in bandages. For the new cold, for the new sorry, for sorry, to make any mark beyond victim, keeping you impossible. Who's so clean, so made of goodness? Europe, delicious and narrow, made of refugees, made so narrow, an idea for us is them to slip between. I touched history easily there, said as she stepped in front of the line of refugees who has a red passport, or papers fraying, a rough folder, who is escorted into a gray room built out of edges, where the sound of shoes on tile is history, is always an airport, always in the tone of voice of uniforms. Until slither out small snakes from the extra papers, a family holds together, not meant to hatch yet, as the passport inside the passport heats up the hope of skin to stay contained until permission stamps their autobiography out. I wrote and wrote their loops until my pages were covered with efficient plastic eye scans, and I stopped penning this about the North and South City everywhere. Knitting razor wire networks, writing progress as the snarl that it is, I went up a globe to the sea inside the sea, the shore upon the shore, and back down to the spread of policy, of poetry, sorry, so polite, and I stopped penning this. Now at the same time, I felt rapture, standing in front of the gold grids, tiles, radiating only gold, and tiny lines between and between, every image always in two. I could barely claim this double joy in my heart in halves, so much that I only want flatness. Please withhold your trick of depth. I was in that marble city of purple-gray light across east and west, where another empire was once basking, as a church, as a mosque. And I settled into ancient steps, marble threshold depressions from the weight of stepping over so many years. The evening glided over me, sending its low light across walls, ablaze with the memory of the digital. I felt the touch of flatness as the call to prayer went swelling, its light finally bleeding out progress over two seas, over rolling seas. I tumbled with this golden light. I climbed the ladder back to the concrete time of the present. A ladder, a ribcage repeating window, mirror, stone, and gold. I climbed the ladder and saw the bones of a border streaming people. And then I saw the stamina of my border, my metal to speak. Each column a throat, each peak my spine doubling, my skin twice a magnet for historical heat, testing my easy love of purple in a city skeletal, asking, how do I write explosions? I am not from Syria, or this line for anyone with an Iraqi passport. She sat in front of the dents in the reed of the loom, through which she pulled the August 1953 CIA-sponsored coup against a democratically elected Iranian government. And separating strands of the warp, she pulled the 1911 Anglo-Persian Oil Company pumping oil out of Iran through. And in the same way, she pulled CIA agent Monty Woodhouse through, making the motion that would hook the strand again and again, insisting that international communism was a threat to the West, as she subsequently pulled the 1 million killed during the Algerian War of Independence through. She pulled Italian colonial rule in Libya through, and through again, she pulled the jailing of the leader of the Tunisian Dowster Party. And through the next slot, she threaded Britain's actions against Egypt's Wafd Party, finally pulling the 44% share of the Suez Canal that Egypt sold to get rid of debts to France and Britain through the next slot. As Britain installed the Sunni Hashemite King Faisal in Iraq, in a heavily Shia population in 1922, and thus she pulled the sectarian schism that would tear Iraq apart after the American invasion of 2003 through the next space in the dent of the loom, as the two great confrontations of the late 20th and early 21st centuries were slotted next, the Cold War and Islamic extremists. She pulled the CIA's covert action against the Soviets in Afghanistan through the next slot in succession. She sat pulling the words from Benazir Bhutto addressing the first President Bush in 1989. I fear we have created a Frankenstein that will come back to haunt us. As she pulled the overthrow of the moderate Pakistan People's Party government in 1996 through, and as Prime Minister Sharif praised the Taliban and promised to emulate it, she pulled the last thread, thereby threading the loom upon which she walked daily, shuttling across her city, preserving the weaver's cross, her freedom and opportunity analytic falling slack, making a pattern alternately bounded and not by the frame of her front door. Now words float down, see the gentle of that. I would look up from this work, put gardenias in my hair. She who shuffles, I, stirring my bag for an inventory of what spills. I would garden the vines, turning from my roots, my internet twines. Is this which continent? Is this the tap of fingernails on a keyboard? That's not speaking, so feminine, so deferred. Some say anything in speech is an event. Council housing windows, can they speak? Where eyes canyon the daily news. Applause in the rap battle courtyard, some say that's not here, not speech enough. Or listening to resist practices, batik being one, or if you tie your tongue as string around bundles of fabric, so hacking the engine of speech. The futurists over there doing something to the library tour guide stop their mauling, but they will start again at another historical intersection, despite protect, despite rights. If an artist, if I put lemons on a plate and paint, that would my speech be? If I protest, this is why art, not always posters. So carry my dividing line with me, then speech makes sense of what is not said, such as mahogany paneled rooms repeating privilege on one side of a city, making the other. This class room repeats, broadcasting its paneling murmurs, its progeny mirrors, its secret how-to. I wrote about speech, but did not know the memory of workers attempting to cross the highway in the seam of sunset and headlights. They lean against guardrails until I watch my breath shallowing as they billow their shirts in shifts behind a fence crossed. I look again and see them sitting peacefully on the embankment of the other side in the sunset of a normal evening conversation. A group wades out into the mangroves, memorizing the hidden roots of a day off. So this watching means I reject speech class, where over-teaching combs away the mistake, where the video shows where I should start, middle, and end. I want the tricky nets. Please give me all the tricky nets, because safety envelops speechgoers who can pay for the curb, to cross safely, to hold their morals by the stem of the glass, and sip in vestibules, where serving trays deliver speech, deliver an identity of ideas, and why I won't practice the headset, there are too many arms, because my ancestors won't fit. Still, to be paid, I partake in their public relations until my smooth muscle rejects, until a nasty little nibble on the finger pointing. Still, to be paid, I stay outside as I walk inside and share a claim to taste, to fold along the seam, for to teach and read the impossible is to know the possibility of the multi-logic. Look under the study. Perform the ableness not to belong. Stop and wander, cast a lazy net, poke holes in the nativist curtain, dig a passage to a province inside of me to upturn my own containers. Who would write a biography of rights? If I disagree using my speech while moving toward you, if my skin disagrees with our rights, if you choke on my speech, if I choke on your body, if I exist disagreeing moving toward you, if you snap my edge, then the risk is living where to be is a risky quote. The archive first was family, how she, corrupter, kept place out of place, making a portable horizon from the diagonal, her fingers pulling the thread, the ontology of mistake, where she set up a laboratory political, so refugee, so to step off the curb of guidelines, the curb of a sentence. She drew a roving across her body, snagging the grid of official family, patriot archive, drawing a feather as father, in code, in total, a system, shouldering, being almost dead, stepping over citizen, non or dis-liberty, anti-body. His papers naturalized and lost, learned her then how to, a man without a country, weave. Now words float down, see the gentle of that. In his office, retyping through sheets of carbon, I live this carbon. He clicks away at my art surface, letting us be citizens. His fingers still click, typing. Thin paper floats between us, and others may wonder what can be taught. I wonder also. They wait for certain speech, but I am inclined to withhold until, because the partial is a trap and not knowing pulls at the fabric of the South Side or asks, who in class can report back to an official? Real is also, I need a nice dress, not on credit, is not a violation of what my mother taught. Writing, not using a pen. Logos, overvalued. Painting, scripting. What if flatness is an ability to love? Not to decide what is next to say or authentic, only recopy existing texts to transmit the distance between speech and power. At the antique souk, he would not sell the book to me. Because of the wrong religion, I was allowed to see the writing inside and not to touch. I asked why without access, without touching. Closing its covers, he answered, we are a tolerant people. If you are a vector without access, if painting and the desire for color crushes, if the vector wants the poem now, painting as bibliography, painting a bibliography, burying narrative under color, under love story, under object, just now finding its shades, a lens for watching the skies change. You go quietly into a garden. Offensive beauty guards against speech, lets speech in, both ways. About a place I do not know, I will never hear the argument so surely again, this speech. And then this is the last part of the book, which I think I'll read, and thank you for your listening so far. And yeah, so this sort of ends the book, and yeah, I'll just end with this poem. Nor news nor strife could hold her love of flatness, nor the solipsism of political poetry written by her love, nor her new love of purple gray and golden light, the pieces lining up as shallow breaths in patterns against her skin, in patterns set into the wall that held the dome, a great lung moving her through the sunset, through 14 centuries of stitches, moving through the silk of his fingers. In this time, they touched a dusting of yellow and marigolds blooming around snaking stones everywhere, giving up the battle against grief. They shuttled through history, a push out of obsessions with clear skin, with clear cause, through into the corner store of laughter. Under the thick evening, the men and their laughter, unraveling whole lengths of loss. How important to hear this song, to see the child carried on her hip, carried underneath so many folds. They put themselves into the air of seeing and took in the bitter and sweet gift of knowing that pain would continue like water in ripples, and that they would never capture the clearing, nor the design of happy. So they tidied their house and sent away the broken dishes from an era when their debt was all they could read. They were not alone as the sun blended their shadows with others across passport lines, flying across strategic targets. A murmur of life spoke in the warm spot under her arm. The child found a nook, a burrowing, as they remembered their travels on raging vectors when they never saw the ground swell, so tuned into what was due, subway fare, grocery bill, rent, to hide the struggle for the shame. Then to disorder this history, to corrupt the script, they came home to clean the rooms they built inside the given rooms, the windows in front of the windows, to see further despite the news of flags, of failures to spread the sense and fiber inside speech, never to be unpulsed. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you so much, Jill. This is just such beautifully and intelligently and attentively textured work, and I love getting to hear it and experience it in voice and in the shared listening with everyone who's in this space. Thank you. And I also want to remind everybody that Anna has placed in the chat a link to purchase and support and continue to spend deeper time with this work. And now I'm going to turn to introducing Ammiel Alcalay. Across his many practices, I think of Ammiel Alcalay as a tremendous infrastructuralist, someone who connects and guides us to connection through a kind of intuitive attention. That quality of feeling, listening, and openness that happens within deep friendship. And what's remarkable is that Ammiel extends this across generation, place, and language. As an archivist, translator, and editor, he has brought so much sensitivity and originality to his offerings, introductions, and new contextualizations of work. And his poems and other writings seem to me so continuous with these modes of presence. In an interview with Marwa Halal for the Poetry Project newsletter, he speaks on some of his early mentors and friends in poetry, Charles Olson, Vincent Farini, Steve Jonas, John Wieners, and the relation of these poets to history and the passing present strike me as very true and realized in Ammiel's work. As he puts it, quote, to have that kind of historical transmission and sense of attention, that to me, I think, is what being a poet can mean. I feel always his passionate recognition for what is substantive and alive in the poem, its activations, genealogies, possibilities, and at the same time, his humility toward what is mutable, ungovernable, and unknowing. Poet, novelist, translator, critic, and scholar, Ammiel Alcalay teaches at Queen's College and the Graduate Center at CUNY. His books include After Jews and Arabs, Memories of Our Future Islanders, and Neither Wit Nor Gold from Then. His translations include Sarajevo Blues and 9 Alexandrias by Bosnian poet Semihdin Mehmedinovic, a 10th anniversary edition of From the Warring Factions, and new essays, A Little History, came out in 2013 from Republic Upset. He is the general editor of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative, a series of student and guest-edited archival texts emerging from the new American poetry, and was the recipient of a 2017 Before Columbus Foundation American Book Award for this work. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Ammiel Alcalay to the Poetry Project.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for that very generous introduction, and really a pleasure to read with Jill at this distance even. I'm going to read something new, and so I'm kind of testing it out, and a lot of it is prose, so I don't know if that will, revoke my poet license, but it's many of you have heard parts of my imperial abhorrences and other abominations, which are very short, bumper sticker-like historical treatises that I've been writing from about 2015 to 2019. And at a certain point, I realized they were too short as a book. So I started writing commentaries on them, which are very involved and very labyrinthine. So I'm going to read the beginning of the book, which has so far 3 or 4 of the longest commentaries. So bear with me. They move in and out of quotations of myself, quotations of other people, all kinds of different things going on there. So, Imperial Abhorrences and Other Abominations, in homage to Edward Dorn. For a long time, I forgot how important you were to me, and it took even longer to remember, but nothing like that's going to happen again. And it begins with 3 quotations. For some years past, many symptoms seem not obscurely to indicate that we tend to sink into that chaos of democratic mediocrity which Henry Adams likens to the ocean, where waters which have fallen to sea level are engulfed and can no more do useful work. In such an ocean, tempests are generated by the operations of usurers, and such tempests are apt to be stilled by massacres, such as have become to us familiar of late in countries like Armenia. Brooks Adams, 1919. First signs of the machine really destroying itself and people is the guided drone plane with atom bomb warhead. Drone is the horror name, deeply named by mysterious high priests in the forums of the Pentagon glare. Jack Kerouac, 1952. The War, the Empire. When the Goths came into Rome, they feared the senators were gods, old men, each resolutely throned at his own house door. When they finally came to Akron, Des Moines, White Plains, the nomads will laugh as they dismember us. Other nations watching will applaud. There will be no indifferent eye, nary a disinterested ear. We'll screech and cry. Philip Whalen, 1966. Consumer demand. If you think of the United States as one huge nostril, a very long arm, or even a voracious mouth reaching down to the Andes and across the fields of Afghanistan, the golden triangle morphing into a shape even Euclid couldn't have imagined, then you're beginning to get the picture. Commentary. Given the impossibility of covering the vastness of the topic, in effect following the currency, the money trail of imperial transition from Britain and France to the US, I will only mention a few salient points. 3 chance occurrences led then graduate student and now noted historian Alfred McCoy to long years of research that resulted in his masterpiece, The Politics of Heroin, an unsurpassed examination of the relationship between the drug trade and strategic geopolitical moves for economic and military dominance. The second of these chance encounters involved meeting Allen Ginsberg. McCoy had just returned from Paris, where he interviewed General Maurice Bayeux, former chief of French intelligence for Indochina, who commented that your CIA had taken over his network of covert allies involved in the drug trade. As McCoy wrote, it was not only General Bayeux who convinced me that the Vietnam drug problem needed investigation. At a street demonstration in New Haven for Black Panther leader Bobby Seale, I met the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, who insisted that the CIA was deeply involved in the Southeast Asian opium trade. To back his claims and aid my research, he mailed me a carton containing years' worth of unpublished dispatches from Time Life correspondence that documented the involvement of America's Asian allies in the opium traffic. In my book, Scrap Metal, there's quite a caustic poem, Harry, War Poem #1, about someone who used to live on my block in Brooklyn, but had become homeless and was camped out by a wall that abutted out from a former bank, now turned health club, and an adjoining row house. Directed mainly at the clueless response by some prominent poets to the events that took place on 9/11, the poem also records the direct effects of the invasion of Afghanistan, with rooming houses on the block sold to drug dealers in order to launder money, and the sudden appearance in sync with the first seasonal crop following the invasion of an abundance of drugs on the street, the likes of which I hadn't seen since the 1970s, when, among many other jobs, scrap metal, I worked briefly at one point for Ike Trabu, as an interpreter at the New York Supreme Court. Originally from Egypt and head of the court's interpreting service, Trabu had been the official translator for the French Connection trial, adding Corsican argot to his already quite impressive arsenal of languages and dialects. While he seemed quite well liked at court, there may have been an element of fear at play, since it's entirely possible that he had something on almost everyone around him. In addition, because of both his appearance and his facility for mimicking various speech patterns, everyone assumed that he was one of them. The abundance of drugs on the street in the 1970s, of course, can be directly attributed to the real-life consequences of McCoy's subject of study. When Ed Dorn's Gunslinger was first coming out in installments from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s, we read it as the news. In a little history, I noted that by 1969, Ed Dorn had already pronounced the death of a character called I in book 2 of his extraordinary book-length poem, Gunslinger. As the stench of putrefaction begins to rise from the corpse of I, we soon learn that I is dead, after which the slinger reminiscens, saying, "It makes me sad to see I go." I was so perplexed. When queried in an interview about the death of I, Dorn refers to a line in which I becomes the container of the thing it contains. Far from some metaphysical meditation, Dorn goes on to explain this as a reference to using our returning dead as containers. Back then, the CIA was sewing kilos of heroin inside the thorax of the cadavers of our returning dead from Vietnam, sewing it back up and shipping the body back to Long Beach, San Francisco, and Chicago. These were the first containers of heroin. This was Air America. This was the first big off-the-books money. The paper of record broke this old story on December 17th, 1972, reporting from Baltimore that an 8-year smuggling conspiracy brought heroin into the United States inside the bodies of soldiers killed in Vietnam, according to testimony from military and customs men in federal court here. Lest one think that all this is something from our sordid past, the head of the Vienna-based United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Antonio Maria Costa, stated, along with many others, that the only available cash keeping most banks afloat during the 2008 financial crisis came from laundered drug money. If more poets still read Ezra Pound along with Marx, or knew who Steve Jonas was, they'd know a lot more about the banking system and how the economy actually operates. Commentary. During the pandemic, I was asked by a Jewish magazine to briefly comment on a poem I had been holding close. I actually had been thinking a lot about Ezra Pound's famous canto on usury. Though I knew that presenting Pound and that poem in particular might cause some problems, I went ahead because it had been much on my mind. After going back and forth with editorial suggestions, I realized that I was being explicitly asked to label Pound with one or another standard and obvious epithet, and it felt like some kind of loyalty oath. So I declined, and they declined. Perhaps it was also a case of me being thought of as one of them. As a parting shot, the piece appeared in the last roundup of dispatches from the Poetry Wars before we closed up shop and went into archival mode. The text. This very notable canto by Ezra Pound has been with me for a long time, and I found myself coming back to it again and again during the ongoing pandemic, particularly as politicians roll out various figures in the trillions and bankers and corporations lick their chops at the idea of a virtually endless supply of newly printed cash and the ensuing financial chicanery that will transfer even more wealth to even fewer people. The idea that private banks exert such enormous leverage on society through charging interest for the use of currency is a practice that outraged Pound, and that he felt to be one of the primary roots of the perversion and loss of value in the human community. Whatever one might think about that, the line, "Usura slayeth the child in the womb," is actually quite literal, since the ability to use or borrow funds affects the very possibility of life. Think of IMF restructuring, followed by bread riots in the so-called developing world, or redlining to prevent the accumulation of wealth by African Americans, to mention just a few obvious examples. If one thinks of interest as a means of social engineering, almost like a thermostat that can be set to have the kinds of sweeping effects that a famine or a war might have, suddenly our perspective shifts, as interest rates can actually determine the fates of whole peoples or a whole generation. Like a mortgage foreclosure, horizons also foreclose. Fewer children are born, the past is no longer transmissible or else is simply eradicated, and whole societies and cultures shrink into themselves to eventually disappear. Pound was famously captured in Italy in May of 1945, interrogated by an agent assigned by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, then imprisoned in a 6-by-6-foot outdoor steel cage at a US Army training center in Pisa, and eventually charged with treason for radio broadcasts he had made in support of Mussolini. In the cage at Pisa, as Pound wrote in Canto 80, "The raft broke and the waters went over me." What rarely gets told in this complex story is that while Pound was one of the few American citizens charged with treason following World War II, during the same month, May of 1945, key Nazi officers, intelligence personnel, and scientists were quietly shipped to Washington, D.C., having been recruited by the burgeoning U.S. national security state to eventually serve in a series of operations with macabre and absurd names like Overcast, Paperclip, Pajamas, Dwindle, Apple Pie, Panhandle, Credulity, and Sunrise. In other words, while Pound, never having actually been put on trial, remained incarcerated at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a building now partially used as the headquarters of Homeland Security, people that, under different political circumstances, would have rightfully been considered war criminals became key players in US Cold War policy and its clandestine operations that assassinated leaders, destroyed peoples and economies, and ensured the hegemony of the American empire and the US dollar. In the present context, as politicians of all stripes grandstand and go to great lengths to cover their collective asses, we would do well to reconsider basic questions of ground. On whose ground does authority rest? In what is it vested? Beyond the hysteria and narcissism that characterizes the whole spectrum of our official current political discourse, where do we, the people, even find representation? For myself, as unfashionable as it might be, returning to Pound's cantos has proven a revelatory and unsettling source. Shortly after this text appeared, a young poet in Tbilisi that I had started corresponding with, Irakli Kolbaya, asked if he could translate the text into Georgian. The day after it came out, Irakli forwarded me the following message from an older Georgian poet that he is close to, Dato Barbakadze. I noticed that you published a piece by Ammiel Alcalay, the author I didn't know about. What an aerobatics of the highest order. And that you would translate that in Georgian is also aerobatics of the highest order. As the spectrum of permissible speech becomes more and more circumscribed, that is to say, right now, this is exactly the precision that will always protect the nobility of poetry from the enemies of freedom. The force of this tiny piece is so immense that all the powers taken together would not even seem the size of a flea next to it. As for Steve Jonas, I had written a poem many years ago that has appeared in both scrap metal and Neither Wit Nor Gold, with each appearance bringing forth very different facets of that memory, just as will its third appearance here. Reflect upon life's rich pageant. In it, the poet alludes to death, madness, distance, and loss. Tonight, sitting in the bathroom with the door wide open, looking through the courtyard at opal and azure glass, blown by magicians and alchemists. Tonight, the air fresh against the body, thinking. Suppose it was an odd place to be, trudging through the snow on Charles Street. No, I never did find your place on the other side of the hill where you said the junkies were. I was with my own that night under the L, waiting at the doorway, Steve kneeling in the middle of the room with a needle, John and someone else shielding the entrance, and that whacked out old hunchback coming down the stairs, ready to have a go at me with a useless Colt 45 cocked in his right hand. Of course, there must have been a cause for the reading we were on our way to. I mean, it must have been for a good cause in those days when a lot of people were getting their heads bashed in or broken open. I've gone a long way myself. It was only later I could give shape to the lie, clothe the colorless in light. I talked about this at length with Garrett Lansing, who had been very close to both Steve Jonas and John Wieners, and Garrett thought that I was either seeing things or had misremembered, because he insisted that needles were not Steve's thing. I could only say what I remembered or how it had seemed to me at the time as a teenager. In any case, everyone who was there except me is dead. The first time I published the poem in scrap metal, it was followed by the commentary below. That poems emerge from matter, from things and experience that matter, and that the field might not be particularly friendly, but part of a constant struggle to assert consciousness coming into being, and the constituent facts of that having happened while everything around you and even within you is only too well prepared to deny any of it ever did. This one took place between two places, 15 or so years apart, sitting in the bathroom with the door open, looking through the courtyard into the window of the little house in Jerusalem, thinking about Boston, knowing certain things, but struggling to pinpoint the actual dates to verify where I was. After Kerouac died, before Olson and Steve Jonas, there was a reading, the Charles Street Meeting House, something to do with Moratorium Day, so it must have been 1969, the huge demonstration on the Commons, and then the march over the bridge into Cambridge. Denise Levertov, Ann Sexton, John Wieners, Ron Lowenson. I even have the pictures I took of them. Was Sam Cornish there? Garrett Lansing? I was supposed to meet my mother at the reading, but met John Wieners first, and we went to Steve Jonas's place under the tracks by the Charles Street Jail, maybe to pick someone else up. And the other part of going to look for a friend from high school who'd run away from home and lived on the far side of the hill, maybe a couple of years later, in the direction of where Scully Square used to be. And that gets mixed in with going to see Ginny McGrath in the hospital, seeing her roll by me with that bright look, straight black hair, very thick wireless rimmed glasses, clearly saying goodbye. A disease? Was it kidneys, the liver? And walking out of there, down South Huntington, away from Mission Hill, back towards the fire station in the village, gone forever, without a trace, disappearing into this thing called America, a little less than 3 decades before the turn of the century. The years of the Pepsi president surely hatched between Silicon Valley and Langley. Not that the others were any picnic. The two Jorges, Guillermo, all the way back to Ronaldo and Ricardo. Nothing was coming in, the frequencies were jammed. So I got the typewriter, thinking there still might be some body memory left to take me back. Commentary. The question I often ask myself, would it actually help if our presidents had Spanish names? Probably not, but at least it's worth trying. The relationship of Barack Obama's campaign symbol and the Pepsi logo has been much commented upon, while the former president's Indonesian background and its particular chronology and circumstance much less so. Various conspiracy theorists can be quite suggestive and thought-provoking in their sifting through this material and are well worth our attention if we dare exercise our imaginations to envision a more truly inclusive and broadly conceptualized political framework, like those igniting the scope of, let's say, Dante, Blake, Shelley, Melville, Leslie Marmon Silko. The radio, of course, is a time-worn trope, Spicer via Cocteau, but the question of biological and cosmic energetic response via different keyboard modes has hardly been explored on the basis of the laws of physics, if a consensus on such laws is even remotely possible at this point. To the neighborhood. When I bought some gum at the bodega, Mike, the Yemenite guy, called me brother. De nada, I said. Afwan, de rien. Commentary. After 9/11, Mike and his family and everyone working in the store donned a variety of baseball-style hats, either with an American flag, New York Yankee, or other appropriately patriotic logo. When people started getting detained, we marched to one of the holding pens near the waterfront on the other side of the BQE to try and publicize the plight of the detainees. Robert Mueller, so fawned over by the liberal media during the Donaldo regime and the Russia investigation, had been called on by Jorge Bush, the son, to become head of the FBI just a week before 9/11. Entrapment of mainly hapless young Muslim men became the ensuing trademark operation, very well documented in Trevor Aronson's 2014 The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured Terrorism. One of the most sensational cases involved the Lackawanna Six, a group of US citizens who had attended a training camp in Kandahar and were accused of forming a sleeper cell. As Aronson wrote, the only sleeper cell they could have formed would have been one in deep hibernation. In reality, the 6 men from Lackawanna, New York, all naturalized US citizens, realized during their time at the camp that they had romanticized Al-Qaeda and the terrorist life and wanted nothing more than to return to the comforts of home. As proof of this, when the FBI was flying one of the Lackawanna 6 back to the US, the man's only question was uniquely American. How are the Buffalo Bills doing? While all were eventually released following conviction, the prodigious amounts of money flowing into the DA's office in Buffalo prompted the need to spend it, eventually leading to some truly out-of-the-box investigations. On May 11th, 2004, Steve Kurtz, artist, professor at the State University of New York, Buffalo, and one of the founders of the Critical Art Ensemble, a group dedicated to radical investigation of their own, woke up to find his wife, Hope, unresponsive in bed next to him. He called 911 for emergency assistance. When help arrived, after noticing laboratory equipment there for work being done with the Critical Art Ensemble on genetically modified food, medics called the FBI. Kurtz was detained for 22 hours, and dozens of agents in hazmat suits descended upon their residence, confiscating Hope Kurtz's body. She had died of heart failure, their car, equipment, computers, books, writings, correspondence, art projects, and even their cat, before sealing up the house as a biohazard, not allowing Kurtz back in for a week. Years of legal problems followed, with possible charges of bioterrorism at the beginning downgraded to mail fraud later, and eventually in 2008, dismissal of all charges. In a 2005 event staged to focus attention on the case and the legal morass Kurtz found himself in, I said, "In a lot of the statements made publicly, I've been struck by the repeated insistence of many defending free speech to begin by either disassociating themselves or condemning the statements of those they purport to defend. Statements begin, while I abhor the sentiments of X and completely repudiate and disassociate myself from them, I will defend X's right to blah, blah, blah." A very strange way, I think, to enact freedom. And we might, in this context, consider Herman Melville's statement, "Freedom is the name for the thing that is not freedom." Speaking of freedom, notorious Boston underworld figure and FBI informant, I grew up in Boston, and though my relationship to the Boston underworld was only tangential, it was not by any means an unimportant factor in my cultural formation. Whitey Bulger, long protected by Robert Mueller, both while he was an assistant DA in Boston and as director of the FBI, was fatally bludgeoned with a lock stuffed inside a sock within 12 hours of his arrival at the Hazleton Federal Penitentiary in Brewston Mills, West Virginia, in late October 2018, in the midst of the Russia investigation. Why Bulger was brought to one of the country's most violent prisons and placed among the general population is anyone's guess. In one of his many letters from prison, having once been subject to LSD experiments, Bulger wrote, "Nightmares, no control. Have them any and all times I doze or deep sleep. Gift from CIA MK Ultra." At an earlier stage of a long and bloody criminal career, Bulger had been an inmate at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, charged with truck hijacking and armed robbery. In hopes of reducing his sentence, Bulger, along with a number of other inmates, agreed to participate in a research program they were told was aimed at curing schizophrenia. According to some accounts, Bulger was given large doses of LSD daily for more than 15 months. The experiment itself was the brainchild of then CIA Deputy Director Allen Dulles, the same person who as director would lead Operation Ajax in 1953, in which the duly elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the Iranian oil industry, was overthrown and replaced by Shah Reza Pahlavi. This was done at the behest of John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, Allen's older brother. In 1954, Allen went on to overthrow the democratically elected government of Guatemala, led by Jacobo Arbenz in Operation PB Success. MK Ultra, referred to by Bulger, began in 1951 as Project Artichoke, operated by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and aimed at the exploration of enhanced methods of interrogation and mind control, using the firsthand knowledge and participation of scientists, doctors, and torture specialists who had worked in Japan and Germany during the Second World War on the side of the US's ostensible enemies. Dulles also recruited chemist Sidney Gottlieb, for whom LSD became a key component of the toolkit. And Allen Ginsberg, Ken Kesey, Robert Hunter, and so many others were actually first dosed through the auspices of MK Ultra, whether knowingly or not, given that the CIA had purchased the full world supply. One of the most famous artichoke incidents involved the case of Frank Olson, a bacteriologist, biological warfare scientist, and employee of the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratories at Camp Detrick in Maryland, the site of much of the experimentation. Olson, haunted by scenes of chemical warfare and its victims that he had witnessed in Korea, considered going public, but before he had a chance, he was dosed under Gottlieb's auspices and found himself plunging to his death from a window in the then Hotel Statler in New York City. After revelations of MK Ultra operations in 1975, Olson's family made an out-of-court settlement for wrongful death and received an apology from the Gerald Heraldo Ford administration, delivered by then cabinet members Ricardo L. Dick Cheney and Donaldo Rumsfeld. But getting back to Whitey, clearly he knew too much about a lot of things, and the fact that he didn't exactly hide his opinions in his many letters written from prison gives pause. Needless to say, there hasn't been a rush to bring Bulger's killers to trial, but his family has filed a $200 million claim against the Department of Justice, charging that the government was responsible for his death. Gottlieb, however, remains of crucial importance in assessing the continuing legacy of the Cold War. It was Gottlieb who, in a sense, broke traditional Ivy League recruited CIA ranks by hiring George Hunter White, a former journalist and street-seasoned Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent with deep experience in the OSS. Working first at Camp X, a paramilitary training camp originally set up in 1941 by the British in Ontario and referred to by White as a place of murder and mayhem, the basic training revolved around the mantra, kill or be killed. During his time in the OSS, White's trainees included future heads of the CIA, Richard Helms and William Colby, Colby being responsible for the Phoenix program in Vietnam, referred to on the back cover of Douglas Valentine's essential book on the subject as a computer-directed program of assassination, torture, and systematic savagery aimed at destroying the Viet Cong infrastructure. Other trainees included one-time CIA Chief of Operations Frank Wiesner Jr., once poet James Jesus Angleton, Chief of CIA Counterintelligence from 1954 to 1975, and someone greatly influenced by literary critic William Empson, author of 7 Types of Ambiguity. White even found anthropologist, linguist, and early cybernetics thinker Gregory Bateson, husband of renowned cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead from 1936 to 1950, under his tutelage. Working under the pseudonym Morgan Hall, White brought a completely different style into domestic MK Ultra operations, setting up so-called safe houses, one in Greenwich Village at 81 Bedford Street and 2 in San Francisco, in order to experiment on the effects of LSD and other drugs on often unknowing and unwilling subjects. This role also allowed White to indulge his own quite extensive catalog of perversions and step slightly back from the more public role he had taken in persecuting jazz musicians by setting up his old Cuban and US mafia connections with club owners to ensure that a steady supply of drugs would be available for musicians, along with a constant threat of entrapment. Most notoriously, White went after Billie Holiday with a vengeance, planting drugs in her room at the Mark Twain Hotel in San Francisco in 1949, charges she was later acquitted for, but which certainly helped break her spirit. No doubt Holiday's insistence on singing Strange Fruit at every gig or concert she played, as well as her lavish style and absolute resistance to racist rule, made her a very public example and threat. The great pianist Mal Waldron, like so many others before and after, suffered unspeakable atrocities at the hand of this regime. Filmed walking through the streets of Paris in his last years, he wistfully recounts, "I think if Billie had stayed in Europe, she'd be alive today. When she went back to America, they persecuted her." In the same documentary about Waldron, singer, composer, and poet Jeannie Lee put it this way: "The Cold War bankrupted not only the Soviet Union, but the United States, and then the corporations in the United States are siphoning off the stuff from the top, so the people right now are really suffering. And when people suffer and there's economic pressure and the government is turning the young against the old, the men against the women, the blacks against the whites against the blacks, the society is so fragmented that if you're an artist of any kind, you're an object of suspicion. Entertainer, okay, but if your creativity and perception pushes the boundaries, then you have to make some kind of excuse for just being alive." General knowledge of some of the basic historical facts and relationships brought up in sections of these commentaries would, I feel, significantly alter our political landscape. Thanks.
Thank you so much. In so many ways, that was also such a deeply woven work, I think. And I just feel really attentive to this question you're posing of on whose ground does authority rest? It feels like such a locative question between both you and Jill. Thank you both so much for these readings. Thank you everyone for listening. I will let you know about what else we have coming up at the Poetry Project. So on Monday, March 8th, we have the Fall 2020 workshop reading that includes students from classes with Aisha Sasha John, Kay Gabriel, and TC Tolbert. Then on March 16th, Angel Dominguez is going to lead a discourse, Architecture of the Interior, How to Save the House. On March 17th, we have a celebration event for the republication of Akilah Oliver's The She Said Dialogues. And then on March 18th, we have our first event hosted by Curatorial Fellows Tierra Narrative. And on March 19th, a reading with Sean D. Henry Smith and Gabrielle Octavia Rucker, with guest introductions from Fred Moten and Hannah Black. A lot coming up, and this was an amazing, amazing reading to start our March. Thank you so much again. We're going to switch everybody's microphones on, or give you ability to switch your microphone on if you'd like. And if you want to say hello or thank you or just express your admiration, please feel encouraged to.